This is
Make It Plain.
Make it plain.
MIP
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make it plain.
Get woke.
As I said, what is the 10 years ago we had Reverend James Cohn with us on the air responding to some of the attacks against him and Jeremiah Wright during Obama's campaign. Professor Cohn was our foremost scholar in the area of black liberation theology. You will hear that interview now, his response to those attacks, and his explanation of God's blackness. Today is the day of his funeral, 11 a.m. at Riverside Church here in New York. A number of us will be attending. Reverend Jackson just left us. He's in town for it. And then we're going to have an esteemed group of people talk about James Cohn's memory. He also talks about, this is a political show, political channel. The Bible is political. And as we said, many of you aren't necessarily Christian, and that's fine. But I think when you hear Professor Cohn, it may even change some of your views about the dogmatic perceptions of Christianity zealously propagandized by the right wing. So, take a listen. Here's my interview with Professor James Cohn, March 19th, 2008. What is black theology of liberation? First of all, just to set this up, and before I bring my very special guest on, Dr. James Cohn, this is an interview with Sean Hannity, who's really pushing this whole thing against the black church. This is an interview, a brief excerpt from an interview he had with Dr. Jeremiah Wright. And listen carefully to the way Dr. Jeremiah Wright references Dr. Cohn.
Branch Davidians. Joining us now for a response to these claims from Trinity United is the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright. Reverend, welcome to the program. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, this is the same church. You do have the website, right, where it says commitment to the black community, commitment to the black
value,
Go ahead.
The black value system, which was developed by the congregation, by laypersons of the congregation 26 years ago.
Right.
Very similar to the Gospel and Sola Tsunami developed by laypersons in Nicaragua during the whole liberation theology movement 26, 28, 30 years ago. Yes.
But we're not dealing with, this is on the website today. Well, let me just inform our audience, and I want you to respond if you can. It says commitment to God. By the way, I'm with you, and I hope you'll pray for me, Reverend. Commitment to the black community. Commitment to the black family, adherence to the black work ethic. It goes on, pledge, acquired skills available to the black community, strengthening and supporting black institutions, pledging allegiance to all black leadership who have embraced the black value system, personal commitment to the embracement of the black value system. Now, Reverend, if every time we said black, if it was a church and those words were white, wouldn't we call that church racist?
No, we would call it Christianity. We've been saying that since there was a white Christianity. We've been saying that ever since white Christians took part in the slave trade. We've been saying that ever since they had churches in slave castles. We don't have to say the word white. We just have to live in white America, United States of white America. That's not the issue. You're missing the issue. As I was trying to say to you, liberation theology, and I thought Eric Rush had studied at a theological seminary that was conservative. Come to find out, he doesn't know anything more about theology than I know about brain surgery. So for him to speak,
here's my point.
No, let me finish. No, here's my point to you. If you're not going to talk about theology in context, if you're not going to talk about liberation theology that came out of the 60s, systematized black liberation theology that started with Jim Cohn in 1968,
Reverend,
and the writings of Cohn and the writings of Dwight Hopkins and the writings of womanist theologians and Asian theologians and Hispanic theologians.
Reverend, I got to get this in.
Then you can't talk about the black value system.
But I'm going to tell you this. Listen,
do you know liberation theology, sir? Do you know liberation theology?
I actually studied. I studied theology. I went to a seminary, and I studied
didn't say
Latin.
no.
I could go.
I said, do you know black liberation
I'm
theology?
very aware of what you're calling black liberation, but let me get my question out.
No, I didn't ask you what I'm calling. I said, do you know black theology?
Reverend, I'm going to give you a chance to answer my question.
How many of Cohn's books have you read?
Reverend,
how many of Cohn's books have you read?
Reverend, I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you the question.
How many books of Cohn's have you read?
I'm going to ask you this question.
How many books of Dwight Hopkins have you read?
You're very angry and defensive. I'm just trying to ask a question here. Barack Obama goes to Barack Obama goes to your church.
You haven't answered my question.
It seems to be when you say the black community.
We'll pause it there, but you get the idea. My very special guest, who is the Cohen that Dr. Jeremiah Wright is referring to, he is the Charles A. Briggs Distinguished Professor of Systematic Theology at Union Theological Seminary. He attended Shorter College, holds a B.A. degree from Philander Smith. In 1961, he received a Master of Divinity degree from Garrett Theological Seminary and later earned an M.A. and Ph.D. from Northwestern University. He has been conferred 8 honorary degrees, including a Doctor of Divinity from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. He is best known for his groundbreaking works, Black Theology and Black Power in 1969 and A Black Theology of Liberation in 1970. He is also the author of the highly acclaimed God of the Oppressed in 1975 and of Martin and Malcolm in America, A Dream or a Nightmare. His upcoming work, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. It is a great honor to be joined now by Dr. James H. Cohn. Dr. Cohn, God bless you for joining us again. How are you, sir?
I'm doing fine, thank you. Very, very glad to be here.
It is always good to hear from you. First of all, just let me get your take on this whole controversy. You just heard your name mentioned on Fox. It was mentioned today on the radio on Fox. Your name has been mentioned the past few days in the Wall Street Journal. Your reaction, what is going on?
Well, I think what is going on is people are reacting to the prophetic message mainly of Black liberation theology and the prophetic message of Jeremiah Wright coming out of his church in Chicago, where he has been pretty much a prophet within the context of the community in which he has been preaching. I don't think people, conservative talk show hosts, can understand or even want to understand what Black liberation theology means.
Mm-hmm. Is Black liberation theology, as you have defined it? But first, let's do this for our audience. And I'll admit to you, many in our audience are white, Dr. Cohn, tonight. Mm-hmm. Give us a definition, a layperson's definition of Black liberation theology.
Black liberation theology came out of the 1960s. It was and still is an attempt to understand the meaning of the Christian faith for the times in which we live, as it especially relates to the African American community that is struggling for justice in American society.
Mm-hmm. Now, is Black liberation theology only for African Americans?
No, I wouldn't be teaching at Union Theological Seminary in New York, which is a white school, if it were mostly for that. Black liberation theology is an interpretation of the Christian gospel for the times in which we live in the United States of America and in the world. And it is a voice, an interpretation that comes out of the African American community. It comes out of there, as all people have to interpret what the gospel means, not only for the African American community, for the particularity out of which they come and live, but they have to interpret that gospel for the world. It begins in a particular place, like the African American community, but it reaches out to the world. So I want understanding of the gospel, which is for everybody. But the way I can do that is to be true to who I am and the history out of which I come. Well, Europeans interpret their theology out of Europe, Nobody says anything about that. German theologians interpret theirs out of Germany. White theologians in this country interpret theirs out of their experience, and black people are invisible within that theology. I want to interpret the meaning of the Christian gospel out of the African American experience, but for the whole world, for everybody, because I think the gospel is primarily a gospel for the poor, the weak, and the helpless. And because blacks are struggling for justice, that gives them a special insight into the gospel, because the gospel is about the empowerment of all people.
Dr. James Cohn, my very special guest, and of course it's an honor to have him on. I want to share with you, this is an excerpt from some of your writings that is been appearing in the conservative press and what have you. I want to read this and get you to expound. Black theology refuses to accept a God who is not identified totally with the goals of the black community. If God is not for us and against white people, then he is a murderer, and we had better kill him. The task of black theology is to kill gods who do not belong to the black community. Black theology will accept only the love of God, which participates in the destruction of the white enemy. What we need is the divine love as expressed in black power, which is the power of black people to destroy their oppressors here and now by any means at their disposal. Unless God is participating in this holy activity, we must reject his love. Could you respond to that, Dr. Cohn?
Yes, I'd be very glad to respond to that. That's a prophetic message that I wrote in the late 1960s in the context of the Detroit and Newark riots, the context of black people fighting for justice at a very, very time in which American government was being repressive against black people in the community. So any time a voice that has not been heard begins to speak, what does a baby do when it begins to speak? It cries out. It cries out to be heard. And what that is the same kind of cry that Amos gave, the same kind of cry that Jeremiah gave, the same kind of cry that John the Baptist gave in the wilderness, and it's the same kind of cry that sent Jesus to the cross. So I am saying that black theology refuses to accept a white supremacist God, a God that justifies black oppression in this society. Now, I believe that. And if you give me a God that supports white racism and white supremacy, I say we must kill that God.
Dr. James Cohn of Union Theological Seminary in New York, 866-99-SIRIUS. Quick calls, folks, 866-997-4748. Your calls for Dr. James Cohn, who is the foremost scholar when it comes to black liberation theology and systematic theology, for that matter. He is a great orator and preacher, and we respect him so highly. Now, Dr. Cohn, it seems logical to me, and hopefully to others who are listening, that the Christianity, African Americans, and let's say other colonized people around the world were given by the Europeans. And that's without even getting into the original roots of Christianity and its African roots. But let's just start with the European version of Christianity that was forced upon people of color throughout the world, either through slavery or colonization. I mean, Dr. Cohn, individuals, including Africans and African Americans, really have no choice. People in South America, people in Latin America really had no choice but to come up with an alternative faith, because if you didn't, just like you said, we'd have to believe that God was all white and only cared about whites, correct?
Exactly, and that is the context out of which I was writing. I was trying to speak a word that would challenge the white supremacy supremacist God that black people have been taught, black people that kept blacks enslaved for 246 years, that segregated and humiliated and lynched black people for nearly 100 years. I am speaking out against that God. And the white church was a church that gave support to that. And anytime you remain silent to evil that's in your midst, you are supporting that evil. But the white church didn't remain silent. They actually participated in the lynching. The lynchings were done by white Christians. The slaveholders called themselves white Christians. So in order to break the influence of that, you have to go back to the prophets, to Jesus, to the biblical message, and there you see God's judgment coming down on America the same way God's judgment comes down on the people in the Old Testament when they disobey God.
Isn't black liberation theology or liberation theology also useful, Dr. Cohn, to oppressed and poor people who are not necessarily Christian and not necessarily religious?
Of course. See, the black liberation theology or liberation theology in general is a theology that supports the liberation of all people who are being oppressed and colonized. You don't ask anybody whether they're Christian or not. You are concerned about what we would call God's kingdom in this world, coming in this world. And that means that we have to work for that coming. We don't just bring freedom primarily to Christians. We bring freedom to everybody. It's out of the Christian context, out of the power of the Christian gospel that we do what we do. But you can do it from other contexts as well.
Now, can there be this kind of liberation theology without some type of political context as well? I mean, it was born out of a political context and political oppression, was it not?
Yes. In fact, if people read that Bible correctly, you know, the whole message of biblical religion came with slaves coming out of Egypt. And salvation in the Bible has always been being delivered from bondage, from hurt, from harm. Salvation means being made whole, and that which you become, it is against anything that enslaves. So you can't have salvation without political liberation. You can't have salvation without social liberation. You can't have salvation without economic liberation. So it's the liberation of the whole person, the whole of humankind, not just some spiritual liberation that is not connected with the social political justice in this world.
Dr. Cohn, Dr. James Cohn of Union Theological Seminary, renowned systematic theology scholar known around the world. Dr. Cohn, in your worldview and in a black theology of liberation worldview, God is black, correct?
Yes.
Explain that.
What I mean, I'm speaking about God out of the context of a black people who've been taught to hate themselves, who've been taught that their blackness is a sign of them being less than human. For more than 300 years, black people were taught that. So when I was a kid growing up, to call somebody black was to insult them. So God always takes on God's self the very reality that causes the oppression of people. So God becomes black in a white supremacist world in order to show that white supremacy is against God. So the blackness of God means that God is against white supremacy. And in other words, God cannot liberate oppressed people from oppression unless God makes solidarity with those people. And that solidarity means that God takes on God's self the same reality that is responsible for the oppression of people. And since blackness is a symbol of black people's oppression, God becomes black, making identification with them in order for them to know that they are not what the world says they are, but rather they are God's children, and their being black is not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be embraced as a part of God's creation of their humanity.
Now, Dr. Cohn, certainly if we would expand that, though, if an oppressed person is Latino,
Yes?
God would certainly be brown. If an oppressed
That's
person
right.
is poor, God certainly, if a oppressed person is a poor white person, God is poor and white.
That's right. Now, it would be poor, not white.
Okay.
Not white. See, because white is a powerful symbol, a negative symbol in the modern world. It's a negative symbol because the world has been divided so sharply, and still is, between black and white and all the colors in between. So what God cannot be today in the modern world, in the world we live in the 21st century, is white. God can be yellow, can be brown, can be any other color, can be gay even, can be anything except white, because white is such a powerful symbol of what has gone wrong with the world. And it's a symbol all over the world, because you can go all over the world and you see white Jesuses and white gods and all of that. And so I would just say God takes on the poverty of the white person and becomes a poor person with that white person. But God doesn't become white, not in a world that is white supremacist.
Dr. Cohn, do you see all of this that's going on as an assault? I mean, they're mentioning your name. Do you see this as an assault on your teachings, on a liberation theology, and on the black church in general?
Yes, I do. But, that assault has been going on black people for a long time. What we have to do is to realize that there are a lot of people who have been enduring that assault without anybody coming to their defense. And why I started writing is because of the white assault upon black people in the 1960s and et cetera. So this assault on me or the assault on Reverend Wright is nothing new. They assaulted King. They assaulted Malcolm. They have assaulted all liberation leaders in the African American. They assaulted Du Bois. They assaulted A. Philip Randolph. So there is no leader. They assaulted Ida B. Wells Barnett. You can go down the list. There is no prophet that is well received within the society in which they do their prophecy.
Dr. Cohn, you would draw a parallel in terms of our experience between the cross of Christ and the lynching tree, correct?
Without question. And what I mean by that is that the crucifixion in the first century was a first century lynching. That's what it was. It was a first century lynching. They nailed him to the tree, to the cross. Now, what does that mean in the first century? How do Christians appropriate the cross and get the true meaning of it, and not that little thing they might hang around their neck or place in their church? How do you get the true meaning of that rugged, ugly cross? You get it by looking at lynching. What happened to Jesus is what happened to lynch black people in following the Civil War. That the lynching was a symbol of disgrace, not just of the person who was lynched, but of the people they symbolized, black people. So, that was true in Jesus' time. Only slaves and rebels against the Roman government were lynched, were crucified. So if you want to understand, if Christians today want to understand why Jesus was lynched, why he was crucified, they have to see why blacks were and are crucified today. And for the same reason, that's why people are crucified today. And the only thing I want to say, if you want to understand the true meaning of the crucifixion of Jesus, you have to see his cross through the image of lynching in America, when more than 5,000 black bodies were stringing from trees and burned up because they symbolized what white society wanted to say was a beast and inhuman. So, Christians should realize that when they worship Jesus, they are worshiping someone who was lynched just like many blacks were. And if whites can appropriate that image, then they might come to know what true repentance might mean for them. And blacks, too, have to see themselves through that image of the lynching. Now, the black poets like Du Bois and Langston Hughes, they saw that in County Cullen.
They saw that and they wrote about it. They
wrote about it. In fact, following a lynching in Alabama, Langston Hughes wrote a poem in relation to the lynching in Alabama. He called it Christ in Alabama.
Dr. Cohn, it's an honor to have you, sir. We've got to do this again and spend more time with you because a lot of people do want to talk to you, okay?
All right.
God bless you, sir. When will your book come out, The Cross and the Lynching Tree?
Well, I don't know. I'm working on it.
We love you, Dr. Cohn. And listen, we're going to keep this line of communication open as this debate rages on. Know that you have a home here to come and talk about things, okay?
All right. Thank you very much.
Dr. James Cohn, our exclusive interview with him 10 years ago now, as a matter of fact. And we are grateful for that time spent. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to be joined now by a very distinguished panel of guests. We invite you to stay tuned for that. And so don't go away. James Cohn's funeral today, Riverside Church at 11 a.m. Sirius XM Progress 127, Resistance Radio. Get woke, ready for impeachment. We're gonna our live stream will stay up through the break, so don't go away. We're streaming on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Make it plain. This is MIP.
This is MIP.
As you just heard, the Reverend Dr. James Cohn in our exclusive interview with him from March 19, 2008, as he reflects on the attacks against himself and Jeremiah Wright, coming from Sean Hannity and the right wing, and also really gives his explanation of God's blackness and black liberation theology. I have an esteemed panel of guests with us right now. The Reverend Dr. Iva Carruthers of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. We'll be hearing from her. The Reverend Dr. Charlene Sinclair, who's a director of reinvestment for the Center for Community Change. Also, whom I believe to be the last student, the very final student Dr. Cohn advised for his master's, our brother, the Reverend Cassius Rudolph, who will be walking at Union in just a few days. So that is our panel, and I'm going to just go around the room as we prepare for his homegoing service at 11 a.m. this morning at the historic Riverside Church. Folks, quick calls with questions, 866-99-SERIES, 866-997-4748. First of all, from the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, one who was very close with Dr. Cohn and one whom Dr. Cohn we know had a great deal of respect for, the Reverend Dr. Iva Carruthers. Dr. Iva, good morning to you. Your personal and beyond thoughts and reflections on Dr. James Cohn, please.
Well, it is with grateful hearts, but certainly a sad spirit that we think about Dr. Cohn. He was, I would say, the mightiest tree in the forest when it came to theological reflection from the lens of people of African descent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reverberation has been heard not only in the forest but outside of the forest, because he was so very, very great and powerful in his words and his deeds and by his authenticity and consistency.
No question about it. Charlene Sinclair. Now, Charlene, you were a student of his yourself, weren't you?
Yes, Dr. Cohn was my advisor when I entered Union for my Master's of Divinity, and he was recently on my dissertation committee, actually a year ago this month.
Tell us about your thoughts and reflections and remembrances of Dr. Cohn, if you would.
I would like to speak regarding Dr. Cohn, not only from his, deep love story with Black people that manifests itself in the books he wrote and the presentations he did in his righteous indignation around oppression, but also the Dr. James Cohn that is known throughout the Black activist world, because many of us just didn't experience Dr. Cohn through Black theological education or through church practices, but rather in the streets, in our struggle for Black liberation. We all had Dr. Cohn's books on our bookshelves, and it was only as we began to talk about what inspired us did we begin to realize that Dr. Cohn transcended the academy and transcended the Black church, and he was alive and vibrant and thriving in the very places that he knew Black people were in struggle. So, and that's the person I experienced.
Also with us, Reverend Cassius Rudolph. Brother Cassius, am I correct in saying that you would be Dr. Cohn's most recent student whom he advised?
Yes, I'll say that I was a part of that class. before Dr. Cohn took his sabbatical a year ago to write his last book that's in press. I was his advisee, and it was a joy to be at Union Seminary with Dr. Cohn being my advisor and professor. I first got word of Dr. Cohn as a student, as an undergraduate student at Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi, and I took a course on black religion. And growing up in the African American Baptist Church, we know what black religion is, but I had not heard of the work of Dr. Cohn until my professor and mentor at Tougaloo and an older brother in the fraternity that was Dr. Cohn's last PhD student, Jamal Calloway, enlightened me of Dr. Cohn's work, and I reached out to Dr. Cohn and through email and through conversation until I got to Union, and he was the first face that I saw as I moved into Hastings Hall. And it's just been a privilege and an honor to learn and to get so much knowledge from Dr. Cohn. And even on a personal level, I saw him like a grandfather figure. He would get, our conversation would be so personal about how it is so important to write what you think. And you write it until you get it all out. And he taught us to develop our own theological voice in the classroom, outside of that space, and to be the best that we can be. And so I'm so grateful. My heart is overjoyed. But it's also saddened because we're going to miss him, but we're going to continue his work. We got to.
Ivor Carruthers, what was James Cohn's influence on the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference?
Well, when a few of us decided we would try to see if the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, in its idea of being a network of clergy and lay leaders who would stay very true to the prophetic tradition, we all had worked in some way or another with James Cohn, and so I personally reached out to him and shared the vision, and he immediately got on board. He was always very ready to contribute what he could as one who was very judicious of one's time, because he did not play. And so once he heard the vision, once he identified who had made commitments, he was fully on board. And so he came to our first convening. This was before we were officially an organization, and raised the question of a church without a clear theology and the need to have persons in the pulpit who could not only speak and preach from the Spirit, but also preached and spoke to the mind. And it was that notion of the imperative of theological reflection attached to the oratorical skills of the preached word and the prophetic tradition that he raised for all who were gathered and gave his full commitment to that. It was very clear in terms of the way he laid out the foundation that he had discovered the divinity within him, that he would never separate from his black identity. And, I'm thinking also of John Clark, who was one of my mentors, who said that if you allow someone to oppress your image of God, you will forever be oppressed. James afforded all of us a way of thinking about the work we were doing, as Charlene has said, about the way we engaged one another, that would require us to claim the divinity within unapologetically and to be able to stand on that in the context of our Christian discipleship.
Indeed.
I knew Dr. Cohn by reputation. When I was away at college, he was in college, and he was in my home church, and my mother became one of his mothers who fed he and Cecil and so forth. And so I knew him by reputation first, and then our lives crossed very specifically when we were both a part of the Black Theology Project, which was really an organization that was a forerunner to the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. And by then, he had unleashed the paradigm of black liberation theology for the world and had connected those dots and had charted a very clear course. He and Gayrod Wilmore, we must lift up Gayrod Wilmore as well, charted a very clear course for us to take as we refuse to separate our identity racially and the experiences we had from our interpretation of the gospel and the call of the church.
Joining us now, along with Dr. Charlene Sinclair, Cassius Rudolph, and Dr. Alva Carruthers, is the pastor of Union Temple Baptist Church, the Reverend Willie F. Wilson. Reverend Wilson, Hotep, God bless you. Good morning. Your thoughts and reflections on Dr. James Cohn.
Well, bless you, my brother. Certainly happy to share and to be on the air with these great sisters who are sharing this morning. I certainly agree with what I've heard said this morning, that Dr. Cohn brought in a very profound way and in a very extensive way a theology, of course, that I am aware of, that existed way back in the 1930s through the four very distinguished black theologians and pastors, Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman, Reverend C. Stewart Nelson, Mordecai Johnson, and Dr. Benjamin Mays. They started what was known as the Rankin Network back in the 1930s because they met regularly at Rankin Chapel at Howard University. And following Dr. Howard Thurman and Benjamin Mays and Mordecai Johnson's visits to Gandhi in India, where Howard Thurman was the first to go, and when he went by boat in the 1930s and he got over there, they asked him, how is it that you come over here saying you're a Christian when the man who wrote the song Amazing Grace, although he ultimately converted and became an abolitionist, was one of the biggest slave owners in America. And how can you come over here saying that you are a Christian when one of the ships that brought your ancestors to America as slaves was a ship named Jesus? And this is 1939. How is it that we were reading your papers in the newspapers in America just the other day, and white Christians were having a service and went out and lynched a black man and then came back and continued having service? Out of that, they developed this reconciliation theology. And, of course, as you know, in the early 30s, late 30s, early 40s, most African Americans, particularly who went to HBCUs, went to either be a teacher or a preacher. And so they thought through the formulation of this organization called the Fellowship of Religious Colleges and Universities that they would teach this new theology, which in fact talked about the social environment out of which Jesus evolved, being poor, being from the ghetto, being black, being minority, being from a large family, that he identified with the black masses of America, and ultimately selected or elected Martin Luther King as the person who would carry forth that theology, unfortunately, in most of the black colleges. But I think that James Cohn took it to a much greater exposure and brought it before the masses of our clergy as it had never been done before, even though these great stalwarts had attempted to do so in the late 30s and early 1940s.
Dr. Charlene Sinclair, now I'll be honest with you, Dr. Carruthers said to me on yesterday that you, having studied so closely under Dr. Cohn, may know him better than anybody. Is she right about that?
I think Dr. Carruthers is referring to the dissertation work that I did on Dr. Cohn. One of the pieces that I wrote was actually a rereading of Dr. Cohn's Black Theology and Black Power through the eyes of Frantz Fanon. And it was in that process that Dr. Cohn made this final statement, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't know all of it correctly. But he said that over the years he had people that told him, this black boy from Arkansas in the 60s, that he was actually building his theological paradigm on the works of white theologians. He said, why would they believe that a black boy from Arkansas would have white people tell him about black people. And then he looked me in the eye and said that when he wrote Black Theology and Black Power, he was reading Frantz Fanon. And so, and I think this is really important because when you read Fanon and you read Cohn, you realize that when he talked about a black beingness, if you put those two in relationship, it was being black that had absolutely nothing to do with what white people were doing. It wasn't a blackness that was created through whiteness, but it was a claiming of your full and complete being and then moving towards liberation as a process of that being. And that interaction and that create, the ways in which we speak about white as this binary that black people must engage. Dr. Cohn's black beingness, his black ontology was, as Fanon said, a refusal to claim a blackness that is nothing but a white artifact. And so I think that is an important piece for us to bring into this equation as we think about Dr. Cohn, not only his history and what he has done, but plant him in the very struggle that he was attempting to engage, his definite desire for black struggle as articulated through the Black Power movement, and his refusal to give up God in that process.
Amen. Cassius Rudolph, as a recent student of Dr. Cohn's, how is the way he advised you and what he taught you, how is that, my brother, going to inform your ministry going forward?
One thing that I could think about, Dr. Cohn says, he said, Jesus said, people who seek to save their life shall lose it. But if you lose your life for the sake of the least of these, you shall find your work. And Dr. Cohn said this so much to me, being a Baptist preacher, and as my pastor would say, getting your learning. His work is so pivotal in this moment, especially when you talk about millennials in the church and how we're supposed to go about letting them know that you can be black and you can be a Christian, because you got to remember you're black first before you're anything else.
Yeah.
So he taught me, and not only me, but all of us at Union, how to bring those intersections together, saying that you can still be yourself while being a Christian. You still can be gay, queer, and still be a Christian. You still can have a disability. There's no other theologian that I know that has opened so many doors for so many other movements than of Dr. Cohn. You're talking about the woman's movement, queer, Asian, the Black Liberation Theology of Disability, which is the most current one. A current student at Union that just graduated about a year or two ago founded this movement because of Dr. Cohn's work. Mm-hmm. So it's because of the work that I've learned, taking Martin and Malcolm, and James Baldwin, and Black theology, that's going to help me continue my ministry and to do this work, not only in the church, but in the community, church and society, which I was taught under Dr. Cohn. This work is so pivotal now.
Rem Wilson, is there enough acknowledgement, or really I should say enough practice of what Dr. Cohn taught yet in the mainstream church today, that God is black, that Christ is black, that God takes on the form of an oppressed people? Are we teaching that enough today in the mainstream black church?
Unfortunately, we are not, and that's one of the sad facts that we must recognize as we relate to the great work of Dr. Cohn, and that is that more often than not, our churches are still espousing, even teaching the same theology that was taught to us on the plantation a couple of centuries ago. And we can only hope and pray that at a time when he has made